So unless you've been living under a rock for the last couple of years, you probably already know that AI is the hot new industry everyone's trying to break into. Whether it's for the high pay or literal fear that AI is going to take all the other jobs, it seems like just about everyone's trying to work in this area. And I'm fortunate enough to work in AI, more specifically computer vision, but more weirdly, without actually having studied AI. So I studied aerospace engineering, which is basically mechanical plus sprinklings of the other ones like electrical and chemical, things like that. So never took an AI/ML course, never even took a statistics course, didn't do data structures or algorithms, and definitely did not study computer science, right? Um, which is kind of like you think like CS or like a literal dedicated AI/ML degree, which those are starting to become more popular. Those are the more traditional backgrounds you think of for AI/ML researchers, and I definitely do not fit that bill. And so I thought I'd share my story with other people who might be studying more traditional engineering backgrounds, but are trying to get into AI because they think it's the future for whatever reason. Um, yeah, so I'm going to talk about this chronologically. I'm going to leave out like tips and advice of this video. I'm kind of just going to talk about my journey of how I got here. And then if this performs well, I'll make a more technical, in-depth, like how to really get in, what to study first, whatnot, things like that. Not that I ever did it with that much rigor. I kind of just stumbled into where I am. But speaking of that, let's get right into the story. So I'm actually going to start with high school, basically just to say that my first impression of coding was terrible. I like did really poorly in AP comp sci. I didn't even get credit. I think I got like a 2 or 1 even, I don't know, on the exam. And I kind of just, while I was still interested in math and science, I was a little soured on coding. So I picked mechanical engineering. So I was like, well, like it's pretty general. There's good jobs in it. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do beyond that. So I picked mechanical engineering. Freshman year, not a ton of interesting stuff relevant to the story happens, except that I switched to aerospace, basically just because the classes down the pipeline seemed more interesting. It was also the fact that like I knew I wanted to work in that industry, and I was just kind of scared to commit to the degree earlier. But sooner or later, I got over it and took the leap, right? So now let's talk about sophomore year. The main point with sophomore year here is that I took all the relevant math. So I took linear algebra, which if you're working with vectors is like, which you're almost always doing in AI. If you're working with vectors, tensors, things like that, linear algebra is super important. And then ODEs for calculus, and probably most importantly, like vector calculus. So if you know like gradient descent, that's vector calculus, and gradient descent is super important in AI. So this is where I'm getting that like math background that's relevant to AI. I had no idea of this, right? Like I kind of just was taking what was on the academic plan for aerospace, and that was that, right? But I didn't realize it, but this would come in handy later. What I did not take, what was not included in the academic plan for my degree, was statistics. So if you know about machine learning, you know like statistics is just as important as linear algebra and calculus. And I just kind of to make sure I knew what I was talking about, I look back at suggested academic plans for other majors at my school, other engineering majors, and while they all include calculus and linear algebra, like they kind of vary in how much they include statistics, or if it's even required at all, right? So I would advise, if I could go back, I would focus more on statistics because it is critically important to AI. Like I just mentioned gradient descent, which is an example of vector calculus. 9 times out of 10, we use stochastic gradient descent. So stochastic, excuse me, meaning random, meaning statistics, right? So immediately we encounter it. So definitely make sure you know your statistics. I also took an intro to C++ class here, which was like super basic, like for loops, if statements, stuff like that. And this is kind of just where I get more amenable to coding and a little less afraid of it. And I'm introduced to C++, I guess, but not to any sufficient complexity for actually coding C++, which I would learn painfully later. Speaking of pain, now we're in junior year. So now we're really in the aerospace classes. And this is where I really start to hit my stride with coding, because in just about any class that's about like dynamics, right? So aerodynamics, thermodynamics, dynamics and control systems, right? Orbital mechanics. Did I say that twice? I don't know. All of these had like modeling and simulation projects and components to them, and it was like critical. Like some of the assignments would literally just be write me a MATLAB script that simulates this effect and generates some plots that are supposed to look a certain way. And this is a ton of coding, a ton of debugging. I don't work with MATLAB anymore, thank God, but it was cool stuff at the time, and I did enjoy it. And this would start to lead me down the path that I went down. which I'll talk about more senior year when I decided my specialization in aerospace, right? And I'm starting to love it. Like at this point, I'm starting to really like coding. In addition to that, I did a research position. It wasn't paid, but I got credit for it, so it kind of counted as like an elective, which was pretty sweet. And I built a demo for an advanced control systems class. So there was like an intro control systems class that I took and performed pretty well in, and there was a newer like advanced control systems class that they wanted a lab component for. And the lab was going to have a physical thing that they could play around with and like tune the controller, like a PID controller, right? So I built this system, modeled it in MATLAB again for the millionth time, and then actually built it and coded it in Arduino. They coded the controller. And that was really awesome because even to this day, if I can't tie the code I write to some form of hardware, like ideally like an aircraft or robot or something sick like that, but at a minimum like actual computer hardware, which is what I do now, I kind of like lose sight of what's going on. I just need to tie it to the physical world. That's just how I am. So that was pretty sweet. This is where I learned that about myself. And then also, the opposite of like building something with my hands. I did an internship on autonomous satellite piloting. So we were trying to train models to pilot satellites to do things. And this is the first time that I really encounter AI in the wild. It's a summer internship. This one was paid, thankfully. And I encounter neural networks here. I encounter reinforcement learning, which is a training paradigm. So just like training in general, right? Like you have a loss function you're trying to optimize against. You have your training data, all that stuff. I mean, in reinforcement learning, it's more training simulation. So it was helpful with having the simulation background, but you get the gist, right? Encountered AI in the wild. I actually really hated this internship, to be honest, for various reasons. I also was like going through a breakup at the time, so it wasn't set up for success. But the whole time while I was suffering through it, I was like, someday this is going to pay off. It definitely did, because this led to all the other stuff I had later. Speaking of which, let's talk about senior year. So at my school, you got to choose between a few specializations. They were aircraft, rotorcrafts like helicopters, spacecraft, which is what you'd probably think I chose. But what I actually chose was autonomous vehicles. This was like a newer one. It was smaller. It had an elective component to it. And while the capstone wasn't really everything I'd hoped, like we were supposed to be able to build a drone and we didn't get a chance to, the electives and the course material were like so sick. The autonomy elective I took in college was probably my favorite course I ever took. And it mostly focused on the GNC loops of guidance, navigation, and control. And that included stuff like sensor fusion and state optimization, a little bit of AI, like the closest thing to formal AI I ever got, but like nothing fancy. Path planning, like Dijkstra's algorithm, all that really cool stuff. And I loved it, right? So I'm firmly like an autonomous vehicles specialty person, as much of an expert as you can be in senior year of college, which is not much, as I've learned. And it did plug some of the holes in my statistics knowledge too, which was really good. That being said, I still wish I had like a core statistics background there. I also took an advanced C++ for aerospace class, which is basically all about flight software. So that was where I actually got to use C++ to a fuller extent. So you've got like memory management, unit testing, some optimizations and compilers and all that stuff. So that's where I really like actually use C++ because all the stuff I was doing in the intro to C++ class, like I could have done in a line of Python. This was like real performance C++ stuff, which was pretty cool as well. And I also got to tie hardware to software, which was fun. And then finally, to end this story, I have one more internship. It was a part-time internship during my last semester because I didn't really have much going on. I was taking like 10 or 12 credits or something small. And that was about low latency computer vision on low swap, so swap being size, weight, and power, hardware, RISC-V processing, a couple other things like that. But I was basically just hired because I knew what a neural network was, how to train it, and had low-level coding knowledge. Because one thing you might notice is like low-level programming, which is critical for performance stuff, and AI programming, which usually uses stuff like in Pythons, like Python, PyTorch, TensorFlow, things like that. Those skill sets, if you can have both, you differentiate yourself really well, right? Because Python code, unless you get to deploy it on something like a GPU, doesn't really perform well natively. So, and then in order to actually deploy it on a GPU, you got to know something like CUDA, which is low level coding in and of itself, like multi-threading, all that stuff that I barely understand and I'm still learning. But yeah, so I was hired for my very basic AI knowledge, and that became my full time job. So I work on similar stuff now. I love my job. I've learned a ton, both about low level programming and like AI proper. And I've kind of stuck with that like computer vision niche with a couple of tangents in there. But yeah, so I could confidently say I work in AI at this point, and I love it. It's been great. Also, I'll add like around junior year, senior year, I kind of noticed that AI jobs, there's a lot of demand. They pay really well. Coding as a skill pays really well, and that kind of like they say, follow the money, right? That combined with genuinely starting to enjoy coding kind of pushed me, or I guess I should say pulled me like gravity, in the direction I wound up taking. It's like gradient descent. There you go. But yeah, so that's how I broke into AI as an aerospace engineer. Believe it or not, like while it's not a like traditional stereotypical background for an AI researcher, it's actually less uncommon than you think. Because at the end of the day, like if you know math and if you know how to code, you can kind of figure all the other shit out, right? That's basically the definition of my career at this point. Um, so yeah, so speaking of figuring stuff out, thank you so much for watching. My name is Ringlorn, not my actual name. My YouTube name is Ringlorn. I'm trying to make videos, authentic videos about engineering for young professionals. So if you're like me, like you get out of college and you're still ambitious, you're still driven, you still like want to develop yourself over time and get really awesome jobs, do cool stuff, make a lot of money. And at that point, once you're outside the structure of college, it's like, what the hell do I do now? And since I graduated school, I've kind of been on this journey of figuring that out, whether it's continuing education, personal projects, or other stuff like this, right? So I'm hoping that I could share the little I have learned with other people, and they could share it back to me, and we could build a community where we all grow together. So if that's something you're interested in, like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.